Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Shovel Knight Specter of Torment. In the last part we started off the game and now we've made our way to King Knight stage in Pridemoor Keep once again. Now something I actually didn't mention during the Plains of Passage, but I find really cool that they did throughout the entire campaign. They actually gave each level a slight variation on its old level theme from Plague of Shadows and Shovel of Hope for this particular playthrough, to reflect the different state of the world at the time of it happening, and it's a lot lower key feeling. The energy isn't quite the same in like a good way. It's like calmer, things are a little happier sounding and all that. I like most of these tracks a lot. I do prefer the main campaign music, but that's just because I prefer the higher energy tracks for a platforming level. But these are all really, really good pieces of music all the same. Now, to add on to something I brought up last time, the level design for each of the levels is changed up for Specter Knight's own mechanics and all that. But by and large, all of the mechanics within the stage are untouched, just now that you have to work around them with the new abilities and level design. Like, King Knight's stage here is still going to have the flying rats, it's going to have the pots of boiling something or other that will pour down and all that. It'll have the book that you hit and makes book platforms appear and all that. And I think this is the right way to do this type of campaign, like I brought up before. I think Plague Knight, for as cute as that story gets, it suffers from the level design largely being one-to-one. This at least changes the levels up enough where they feel like new levels, but also they don't have to worry about making completely new mechanics for everything. If anything, the campaign they did that for was King Knight, because that place has a lot of different things going on. In that regard, it is probably one of the more interesting campaigns for a returning player, but it's also one of the harder campaigns for that as well. The best way to put it is, if Plague Knight is how, like, classic and X-era Mega Man handled different playable characters, where it's new mechanics for character abilities in the same level design, Specter Knight's more of an outright hard mode in how the levels are redesigned. Second quest as well is also potentially a way to look at it overall, which honestly, in a way, makes sense just from the poll results. Like I mentioned in the Shovel Knight, I believe during the Plague Knight playthrough, the way that the later 3 playable nights were determined was via a vote on the Kickstarter before the main campaign was released, called the Dig the Vote campaign. In that, backers could vote for new campaigns to be added for any of the 8 Order No Quarter members, the Black Knight, and the Enchantress. Specter Knight was actually the campaign that won that overall, with like a total average score by the end of it like 6.51 on their metrics. Plague Knight took second at 6.49, and King Knight took third place at 6.02. So in that regard, treating Specter Knight as kind of a hard mode remix stage design thing makes sense, although it makes the fact that King Knight's is probably the most different campaign overall kind of interesting, considering his place as the third place of those victors. Mind you, the fact that he was released last could also play into that as well. If you're curious about the rest of those rankings, Propeller Knight took 4th, then it was the Black Knight, then the Enchantress, then Polar Knight, then Mole Knight, then Tinker Knight, and then Treasure Knight. I want to say, from my limited experience with the showdown mode that's in Treasure Trove, that at least some of the other gameplay concepts within the Knights eventually made it into the game in some form. On top of that, I think some of their other concepts were at least revisited in Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon, which is a mobile and PC spin-off for the game that is sort of a puzzle game. I've basically never touched that myself. My partner's gotten more into that than I have. The only Shovel Knight spin-off I've actively played myself is Shovel Knight Dig, where I did one full run that got to the final boss, beat it, and I was like, alright, I'm good. It's neat. I might do an LP of it at some point after I get what I think there's a true ending in there somewhere. But I'm not big on roguelikes or roguelites, so that's not exactly the most likely thing. Also, as you may have seen throughout this stage, gold armors in the main campaign of Shovel Knight are a nightmare to fight because they actually have a shield that they can block in the front and above. But as we've seen already, the claw with Specter Knight can just tear through their defenses in such a way that they're not as big of a problem anymore. But you're also seeing they do some nice little remixing even with the enemies themselves to make puzzles in platforming for Specter Knight himself. For instance, the mage enemies, we've seen them around since our first trip into Pridemoor Keep as Shovel Knight 3 or 4 years ago at this point when it comes to IRL time. Their magic can also just be dash/through to help you either reach red skulls, reach new platforms to get extra money, or even just to reach the next part of the level design anyway. And I think that's where Specter of Torment can really shine, is the platforming puzzles they make, not just out of the platforms themselves, but the enemies placed within. Because that, I think, is a very important thing for games like this that have extra movement utility in them, is if just the platforms themselves are the puzzle there, half of the things that you're dealing with aren't used, I think, to their full potential. That's actually one thing I really like about Mega Man on the whole. I know I talk about that series a lot, I can't help it. There's the Willful Wisp for this particular level. It's why I go into this stage early, because that's a good way to get some extra health. Something I've actually never tried to do in this campaign is to go through the levels in such a way where I get only the darkness ups first. Because even though you can access every level from the start of the game, I do think the general level curve and difficulty is still there in this campaign, where, like, King Knight and Specter Knight's own stage are easier than Plague Knight, Treasure Knight, and Mole Knight, which are then easier than Propeller Knight, Polar Knight, and Tinker Knight's stage. But I do think they do a good job in this particular campaign of at least making the curve a little less extreme than it is in either Shovel of Hope or Plague of Shadows. Because in those campaigns, the latter stages, so to speak, are noticeably harder than the first set and second set, so to speak. Oh, also, another ability I actually haven't talked about yet with Specter Knight's platforming. You can dig through the dirt, as usual, with just your physical attacks. But because we don't have the ability to aim downward with our attacks normally, like you do with either jumping and then throwing the bombs as Plague Knight, or just, jumping and holding down as Shovel Knight, the way you actually dig downwards as Specter Knight is just by jumping. Jumping off of him with his greaves will just destroy the dirt. That does lead to the factor down the line when we eventually get the dirt that you would just pile drive through as, like, Specter Knight, or Shovel Knight, rather. There's too many S's. Where you will just land on it and then dive through without even having to jump off. But on the whole, it's actually very natural to do. There's actually some instances where if you're smart about using, like, the claw or other sub-weapons, you can just create a very safe haven where the dirt never gets destroyed because you're not properly jumping off of it. It's really interesting to deal with. I think they actually did a really good job with Specter of Torment in particular, with making good and interesting mechanics that are separate from the other characters while also making the stage design use them to good effect. Also, something you're going to see me do a couple times throughout this LP is coming up. I get paranoid that I missed one of the 10 skulls in basically every single one of these stages. So often, unless I'm keeping count and looking at the top left, I will pause the game and take a look at the gear page, where you can see how many out of the total you have for the particular stage, as well as out of the total of 100. Oh look, it's the loyal lapdog, here to do your master's bidding. Chasing your tail around the valley must be tiring. In fact, you look like death. As our leader suspected, you dawdle and play at nobility. I've been tasked with setting you back on schedule. What should I do? Grab a shovel and start digging? Just thinking about it makes my flawless face flush. Working is for commoners, but I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty. Watch. King Knight has a lot of his old moves, but also quite a few new tricks up his sleeve this time around. He'll still dash across the screen and slam on the ground. When he slams the ground, now it takes a note out of Dracula X on the Super Nintendo and will actively make some of the tiles on the floor become pits. Some will raise, some will lower, and all that, so you have some very uneven ground to work with. Also, his confetti is now replaced by cards that will pause once they've reached a certain altitude and move in a direction marked by an arrow next to them. If he falls into a pit, he will rise back out of it with some of the propeller mice. While that's happening, he will also, I think, be throwing some extra cards at you. Technically a more dangerous fight than his older ones, but ultimately King Knight is still King Knight, and thus pretty easy even with early game health. With that said, this visit to the Tower of Fate is where you're going to start seeing a form of my normal lap of sorts pop up, where we talk with Red to see what new curio I can get. I either head to Manny or Legion to see which of the curios I have that I want to upgrade, or which armor I want to get. We're going to hit up our little gold armor friend again, but also there's two particular NPCs of sort that newly spawn in after a beaten stage happens, and I'll show those off in a few moments. For now, though, it's time for us to get our third curio, and this is one that has some toolkit use, but I think it's better on a first run where you're being a lot more cautious than a second run. The Shadow Mirror. Cast a reflection attack from distance. Effectively, it spawns a clone of Specter Knight in that cannot be damaged, but can clip through geometry to do either damage to enemies ahead of you, or to destroy blocks from ahead of you. There are some setups where this can be really good, especially if you're trying to hit an enemy through a wall that would potentially block you, or hit you into a bottomless pit. But again, it is better on a first run, or at least when it gets upgraded, where I think at that point it can also collect gold. By and large, Specter Knight's list of curios are just about as good as Shovel Knight and Plague Knight's, but there are some that I think are a little situational, or at least you get too late for them to be really useful. Here, though, we got the Sickle Boomerang. It's the Cross Boomerang from Castlevania. You throw it forward, and then if it hits nothing, it'll come back to you. If it hits something, it will just stop there, though. Decent projectile attack, has some good range. I do prefer other ways of attacking from a distance in the long run, though, but I still use it here and again. Next up, I'm going to go invest in my favorite armor for Specter Knight in specific, which is the exact same thing as my favorite armor for Shovel Knight. I'm going to get the Striker's Shell, which allows us to hold extra charge, and then release for superior sight swing that does double the damage. That can also stack in with your dash slashes to do double damage as well. I like this a lot. It takes out most enemies in 1 to 2 shots, and for boss fights, especially with dash slashes to begin with, you can pile on the damage really quick.
It sure is drafty in here, but I still carry on, just in joke, you know, while scavenging for customers.
Ha. Ha ha. Ha. I actually like that guy. I think he's kind of funny. Gilding is how you show the world you mean business. You know, can't have a kingdom without flashing some gold. Why, thank you for the extra gold. Oh, look, the sniveling servant here to wait on me. Hey, you, servant. Yes, you. More chickens at once. Glamorous. That's the NPC I was talking about in question. When you beat an Order of No Quarter member, they'll actually show up at the dinner table here and get some neat little dialogue. And now I'm going to go upgrade my first curio with Legion. I'm upgrading the Dread Talon in specific, which makes you resist interruptions from getting attacked, but also generally increases its attack range, making it still a very good offensive option. Serving Mole Knight's the worst. If I'm not on guard, he makes me dig. Don't even get me started on the temperature. I wish I could work somewhere cool and wet. Well, you might notice the lamp above us is once again a different color. There's a whole cycle of different armors we end up turning this gold armor into, and I think it's kind of neat. You can miss with the fire eventually, but the gold armor themselves moves slowly enough that it's not too bad. Spamming 2 slashes in and then getting the 3rd one in right when they move below it, I think is the best thing to do overall. What's the big idea? My suit's all rusted. Hey, like this I can pass myself off as a guard of the Iron Whale. I'll need some kind of nautical attack. Whatever, I'll just grab an anchor or something. I don't know why. I love those dialogues in specific. While this is a more serious campaign in its narrative than a lot of the other ones are, the usual humor is still there for this particular playthrough. Next up, though, we're actually going to head after Specter Knight's own level from the main campaign to chase after the Phantom Striker in the Lich Yard. I'm split on this level myself. It's still an easier level than a lot of the later ones that we're going to tackle, don't get me wrong. And they do a good job of making the mechanics work really well around Specter Knight's abilities. It's just that, if you're familiar with this channel, there's one particular type of platforming mechanic I really can't stand, and it's pretty much exclusively used in this level in this particular entry. With that said, we still got these weird little moss orbs. When you hit them, they go about a jump's height in the air, which makes them prime for dash slashing to get even higher. As Shovel Knight and Plague Knight, you can hit them again to make them ascend to a 2nd height, and you can still do that as Specter Knight. However, because jumping and attacking automatically does a dash slash in this particular entry, you need to be standing with them at a parallel height to make them reach that 2nd altitude, which there's only a few occasions you can really do that in the stage to begin with. We also still have the ghost enemies that you can attack, but they only get phased out for a second when you attack them. You can't kill them outright, which on a first playthrough actually kind of confused me, because I kind of figured, given the Grim Reaper aesthetic of Specter Knight, that he could actively take them out. But now that I look back at it, given Specter Knight's sort of a hard mode, remix mode, compared to the Plague Knight and Shovel Knight campaigns, them keeping that rule consistent, I think, is ultimately for the better. It just definitely threw me off on a first playthrough. Also, this particular room always makes me laugh because of something that usually happens to me in here. So this is a super skeleton right here. This is a mini-boss that's going to occur a couple times in the stage. They're going to roam all over the place trying to jump into you. This particular one has a penchant for jumping into the far left hole if you stand in certain places, killing it instantly, like so. The fact that you do that's always made me laugh. Coming up, though, and I'm going to say this outright, photosensitivity warning, because a lot of the rest of the level's main mechanic is darkness platforming. Lightning will strike, which is the only time you can actively really see the level design around you, which means the screen's also going to flash quite frequently. They do hide some red skulls in situations during these, which is kind of annoying, but There are games I think that have worse darkness platforming than this. I usually bring up that one Ninja Gaiden 3 stage, I believe it was, as a good example of that. But before that, we want to come over here and jump on this to find this little secret area. This is a slight carrying trend from the Plague Knight campaign. I'm Specter Knight. Oh wait, you're Specter Knight. Did I scare you? Jumped up and everything just like you said. Indeed. I kept your hideout safe and sound. Only Specter Knight gets in here. Nobody else, not a soul. Similarly to how in Plague of Shadows in the Explodatorium Plague Knight's own stage you can find his bedroom, here in Specter of Torment in Specter Knight's future stage we can actually find his little hideout. I believe finding this pops a feat/achievement/trophy in all versions of the game that actively have them in some form. But ultimately there's nothing to really do here, it's just a neat little secret you can find. I like the detail, it's nice. Also, you can slash at this particular painting for some reason and it spawns in a ghost. If you squint, that room might also look a little familiar if you remember the Shovel of Hope campaign, but we'll talk more about that later. So, it doesn't really exactly apply to this campaign, but I believe in the previous 2 playthroughs I did read out the little, bios they have for each of the knights we fight along the way. So I'm still gonna do that in this playthrough, despite the fact some of those bios have information that's more pertinent to, say, the Shovel Knight campaign. For instance, a lone warrior, Phantom Striker, appears to those that he deems worthy of challenging him. Light on his feet and wielding a fencing foil, this enigmatic fighter also controls the power of lightning. Always in search of an honorable battle, Phantom Striker may reward those who fare well against his cyclonic charge. The last sentence in specific there shouting out the fact that in all other campaigns in the Treasure Trove, he's effectively a bonus boss that spawns on the world map, whereas here he's an active story boss for lore reasons. Coming up though, we're actually coming up on a new mechanic for the Lich Yard now. One-way walls. These green spirit walls, you can walk through the quote-unquote bottom of them, because some of them are horizontal, but you cannot walk through the solid green side of it. I like this a lot because they do some really interesting stuff with it, with the wall run. But there are some times where the jumps they want you to make for some of it is a little sketchy, I won't lie. But again, given this is meant to be a harder mode to begin with, it's not that big a deal. And this is one of the few times you can do what I was talking about earlier, where you can actually hit the green moss from second altitude to ascend it. This is one of my least favorite screens in every single campaign it's in. While I'm thinking about it though, let's go read King Knight's bio really quick. King Knight isn't a king, he's a king-themed knight, but that doesn't stop him from making decrees. As the Lord Defender of Pridemoor Keep, he commands a formidable army of minions, experienced with repelling invaders who dare to try topple his malevolent monarchy. King Knight is a master of single combat, and because he's dressed to the nines in almost all times, he's always ready for a brutal coronation. Pros, he's got a commanding presence, he's charismatic, and he's a snappy dresser. Cons, not actually a king. We are coming up, though, one of my least favorite red skulls in the entire campaign, that one right there. Because you need to make a relatively tight jump to get up to this one using this particular lamp. I think you're meant to also use the ghost and lead it downwards a little bit here, but I just never felt comfortable with this particular one. Out of the 100 red skulls, there's only really a couple that are really on my shit list, but this is one of them. With that said, checkpoint system in Specter of Torment works the same way it does in the main campaign. You die, you're sent back to the last checkpoint, infinite lives, but you do lose money at every death based on a percentage of the gold you had in total across 3 bags that you can then pick back up. But given the position of those 3, I don't exactly have an easy way to do that unless I upgraded the mirror, the shadow mirror in specific, I believe. Which, since I haven't upgraded that yet, I'm out of luck for that particular gold, but oh well. You can still break the checkpoints to get some extra gold along the way, but that has the cost of a death being more costly in terms of the progress lost. But there is, I believe, still an achievement/feat for breaking every single checkpoint in the game, which I have yet to do. I've only actually platinumed and gotten 100% in Shovel of Hope. I like all the extra campaigns, I just actively haven't gone after the achievements for some reason. I think it just doesn't feel quite as good to me to do, given the amount of them, because I think there are technically less trophies, quote-unquote, in specific, in the later campaigns. It's usually like, yeah, do these specific feats and then get all the feats is what they usually have, which the feedback on that just doesn't feel as good as getting an achievement for every single feat like you do in the Steam release or in the Shovel Knight campaign in specific. With that said, the next screen has another new trick for the Lich Yard: Soulfire. When you slash it, it gets put out a little bit, but it will reignite itself into the main blue fire that'll actively damage you after a few seconds. You do have a lot of weapons that can actively take it out though, because while your side slash can do it, as can the sickle, as can basically any physical attack you have access to at this point. So if we went after this stage a little later, you could even have more ways to put it out. but that gets us our first Darkness Wisp, which actually increases the amount of MP we have in total, so you can now go a little more haywire with your curios. With that said, like I believe I brought up the last part, or maybe even earlier this part, the amount of MP a curio takes depends on the curio in question. With that said, I don't think upgrading the curio makes it cost more or less off the top of my head. Now, something worth noting as well. When Shovel Knight launched, it was just the base campaign, of course, and Plague of Shadows was added in that as sort of a reward for beating the game as an extra playthrough after the fact, which also explains that game's very similar level design. But Specter of Torment is actually where the Treasure Trove rebranding happened and made the game an entire compilation of all, eventually, 4 campaigns in one package, although you can still pick up Specter of Torment individually, I believe. Same with Shovel of Hope and King of Cards. To this day, Plague of Shadows is the only one you cannot get individually. Additionally, as a part of that, with the Treasure Trove thing, they added in a few more challenges for Plague Knight. They added in body swap mode, which I believe I mentioned in the other 2 campaigns. It's a gender swap mode of sorts, so King Knights, Queen Knight, and all that. And they did really good about actually redesigning the characters to feel like new designs that are these genders rather than just pasting boobs or wider hips onto the sprites and calling it a day. It's where they finally added the sound test to the title screen, but also it's where they added the co-op mode to every other platform, because for a good while that was exclusive to the Nintendo releases if you had amiibos, which I've still yet to actually mess around with co-op mode. I've seen playthroughs of it over the years, of course. A certain someone screaming Infinidagger comes to mind, but I've yet to mess around with it myself. I have some people I could probably talk to do a playthrough of that at some point on like stream, though. I think that could be kind of fun. With that said, we're coming up on the final screen of the Lich Yard, which was where they throw every mechanic at you at once. So we got the moss, weird droplets, we got the darkness platform, we got the fire. It all comes together for a time that I'm not exactly a fan of, mostly because of the darkness platforming. Now, I think in order to get this red skull, they want you to use the throwing sickle, but I do believe I have just used, say, the shadow mirror to try and take out that fire before, as well as just try to tank the hit and use the invincibility frames to get up there. Because I do believe, despite his lesser health to start, that Specter Knight has the exact same amount of invincibility frames, so you can use those to get around certain hazards. Although, on that note, I should note, actually, something I've forgotten to note about Specter Knight. He also just jumps less high than Shovel Knight. He's like Plague Knight in that regard. Shovel Knight, I think, has the best jump out of all 4 playable knights off the top of my head for the main campaigns. At least I think. It's been a while since I last played King of Cards. I played that at launch and haven't touched it since.
A surprise attack, hardly befitting the honorable warrior I had hoped to meet. Ah, the Wraith yet speaks of honor, having surrendered his own, to serve as an errand boy. I merely invite you to continue your trials at the behest of the Enchantress. Her power is unmatched. And she expects this empty, broken husk to intimidate me? Your power is untrue, but mine comes from within. Let me demonstrate. Those aren't almost the exact same voice. Shush!
The Phantom Striker's a pretty fast and damaging fight if you let him do a lot of stuff. He can raise his rapier in the air, which will then strike him with lightning, sending projectiles in either direction that he can then shoot out of his rapier directly as he jumps. He can cause lightning orbs to swirl around in one particular part of the screen, which is less of an active attack and more of a way to prevent you from using certain parts of the stage to your advantage. He can disappear for a little bit and send lightning orbs at you directly. And around half health, you'll start making lightning strike the screen every couple of seconds, so you need to make sure you're keeping on the move. Dangerous, but doable given your own moveset at this particular point, especially if you've gotten all the curios up to this point. I like this fight a lot.
You may match me in battle, but you and your cohorts are unfit to rule this land. Your days are numbered, wretch. I'll roam free and see your kind vanquished to the last.
Well, I hope the Enchantress is fine with us not getting 2 knights. But with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're gonna head after our next few numbers of the Order of No Quarter. See you guys then.